So then, we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant, from the Aramaic English translation of the word, and it's from the translations of the original manuscripts. And these manuscripts, they delineate very clearly the tasks of the Gentiles and the tasks also the set apart and the viewpoint of the Creator. Very important these days, because unfortunately when the Greco-Romans they tried to translate the holy manuscripts, they made many mistakes, and some of them they were aware of and they did it on purpose, and some of them they didn't. So understanding then from the viewpoint of the Messiah and what Shaul the Shaliach said in Hebrews, we understand the writings of the Hebrews were done, and Shaul the Shaliach wrote to his countrymen because there was no other person that would be able to define these areas of intricate understandings of then the seven spirits of Elohim. He had the understanding of the Gentile, he had the understanding of then the renewed covenant, the previous covenant. He gives understandings of then the nearing line, he gives the understanding of the kingdom to come. And this endowment of such a high knowledge was only at the time found in Shaul the Shaliach. That's why when you read the understandings of Shaliach Shaul related with the Hebrews, you would find then sections of it related with each of those functions of Ruach HaKodesh. And of course it would have to be, because the maintenance of his presence in each tabernacle would require the understanding of those functions. So then Shaliach Shaul, when he was then explaining the situation regarding Hebrews, then the 10th chapter, he explains also the importance of then the prophetic events to come via the shadow Torah teachings. As we understand, only half of the Torah was completed, the spring feast was completed, and then the second part is yet available and should be completed shortly. So then, when Shaliach Shaul was explaining the understanding of these prophetic events to come, obviously he was then making dual layer regarding then the service of the priests. This precisely relates with then the significance of these prophetic events, but in enlightenment of the grace imputed in the Torah for the Gentiles. Because grace, mercy, and faith, those are not for the set apart, those are for the Gentiles. So then later, when he explains the feasts, he explains then their duties, and he compares then what it meant of the actual feasts versus those that would be prophetic events to come, and he explains not the substance of themselves. He meant it's not related with the feasts, but then the prophetic significance of the events to come. Understanding, for instance, what it meant when revelation would come. Because what he was saying to us was there is a link from the future understanding of the renewed covenant directly related with the previous covenant without even being mentioned in the renewed covenant. So any person trying then to make any changes in the renewed covenant, he would be caught, because there is a link from the previous directly to the revelation without having any relation with the renewed covenant. It's very smart. So this is precisely what he is saying. For the Torah, related with the Torah writings, there is then the shadow prophetic events to come. But then he explained it's not the substance of themselves, that he is speaking of, but then the events to come. So from the writings of the Torah, you can establish the prophetic events to come in the future at the very end without making any relation with the renewed covenant. It shows then the validity of the renewed covenant in the enlightenment of the previous covenant. Any other copy trying to make twistings and trying to counterlies the scriptures, a person would be caught. And when a person makes a proclamation and the Torah was abolished, then it's absolutely ridiculous. A person doesn't have to read the scriptures anymore ever again, because it defeats the purpose. If you don't understand that only half of the Torah was then completed, and if you think the laws, the whole establishment of the instructions were then abolished, then don't read the word anymore. Because Torah means instructions. Those are not laws related with an unchanging view of who you are. The Torah is always stable, but we ourselves, we are always changing. Because we are changing and renewing our minds from the Hebraic perspective. Was it not what Shaliach Shaul said, renewing the mind daily with the reading of the word in Hebrew and understanding then where the Messiah came from? So this is what Shaul the Shaliach meant. So then, understanding later the 11th chapter, then you can understand he was explaining then the area of faith. Previously then, in the end of the 10th chapter, he is explaining those people that then were drawing back. What does it mean? It does not mean a backslider, as we understand from church junk. He is explaining those people, his countrymen, that did understand the grace imputed in the Torah, but they did not want to be mixed with the Gentiles. So they have drawn back to their previous covenant, and then they were forcing the Gentiles to maintain the Mosaic law. That's what he meant. But we are not of that drawing back, but then those that lead obviously to perdition, because they themselves then are led to perdition if they draw back to the previous covenant. And then later he states in the 11th chapter, and then he speaks of faith. Faith is simply believing what the Messiah said. There is no persuasion of what's to come and the hope in the actual fact. This is junk. They tried to concoct some sort of a theory to confuse you. Faith is simply believe what the Messiah said. You don't have to persuade, you don't have to manipulate, you don't have then to give people hope from a manuscript that you don't understand. But we should be acquainted with the previous covenant, and then the renewed covenant from the Aramaic Hebraic understanding, and then sharing with them the understandings from the Messiah, so then people can have hope. But people, they have hope because of what the Messiah did for them, and this is what faith means, believe what the Messiah said. So then when he was explaining these areas, obviously he was explaining to those people of his that unfortunately then they were drawing back to the previous covenant. And Shaul made a distinction not to do these anymore. Then you link up your mind, your understanding, then from the time he said when he was a child, he spoke as a child. When he became adult, he then spoke as an adult. So what you get from this understanding is this: some of his people, of his own countrymen, decide to draw back to the previous covenant to childish actions. Those were the childish steps of the previous covenant. So then Shaul, when he was given this understanding, he was then making a reference of the renewed covenant regarding the second service. As we understand then from the previous covenant, there were many areas where people then would have to be enlightened to understand in their minds. Because the greatest mistake in every establishment is thinking that the scripture then related with the Torah were abolished. It's an absolutely deadly statement. Never, never, never say that the Torah was abolished. Never. Only half of it was completed. Because we are not speaking of the substance of themselves. We are speaking of the prophetic shadows to come. So then, Shaliach Shaul was explaining many times what he meant, and what he was then explaining. However, try to understand. You find every time there is a sentence related with the previous covenant and also the renewed covenant, those are layers. You have to try to learn how to put layers in your mind. Because layers, when you read a section of it, you relate it with the previous covenant, and the previous covenant not only you find it then in the Torah, then you also must find in the prophets. Because the prophets, they were sent because people were drifting away from the holy instructions. Then while he was then, or speaking of the prophet, pointing people back to the instructions, then also the prophets, they were giving future events to come, so then it would comfort the people. So they would return to the instructions, however, they would have a new enlightenment of obedience. Both of them related. So areas, for instance, where you find in Leviticus, then also many areas you find in Yeshayahu or Isaiah. Yeshayahu is the best. And then you find sections of it related with the previous time of Yeshayahu and also the future. That's why then people, they were comforting each other with the scripture. So then he said in the 9th verse of the 10th chapter of Hebrews, and understand, you are excused from Hebrews. Hebrews is not for you. But you can understand what the Levitical people should be involved when they read the renewed covenant and the Hebrew Megillah. And afterwards he said, behold, I came to do thy desire, O Elohim. Hereby he abolished the former. Okay, the understanding of the abolishment is related with the sacrifices. If you read the 8th and the 7th verses, then he said, behold, myself come, and it is recorded at the first from the Megillas to do your desire. He first said sacrifices and oblations and holocausts for sins that were given to him, those were not pleasing. So when he said abolishment, was then the sacrificial system, not the holy laws. The holy laws remained. However, the sacrificial system was replaced with the presence of his Son in his holy tabernacles. So the former that established then the second later. because he's speaking of then the enlightenment of the prophetic shadow. Try to understand. He's speaking of then the former, the previous covenant, so that he might establish then the second renewed covenant. Layers, dual layers. And you then understand then the prophetic shadows from Leviticus. And it's becoming a whole lot more interesting, because then you can make your own notes, and in it then you begin to relate, such as a line, making a layer of it, and then you begin to link up those areas of the previous covenant and the Torah and the writings and the prophets with the renewed covenant. In each of those areas they must harmonize, and they should perfectly, until the closing of the age. So then he later stated for the people then in another Megillah to comfort each other with these words, because these are very comforting words, because then the Messiah was then be found in each tabernacle. So many people, they are thinking the Messiah went up and he is there lost in heaven or at the right hand of the power, and he doesn't speak with the people anymore. Understand, he is a person, and his very presence in person, in a form of a spirit, is found in each tabernacle. Thus, tabernacles around the world, mistakenly taken by church. Church does not exist, because does not maintain the continual service of the tabernacle. If you read precisely the scriptures, you find the word continuously. Continuously, continuing the service of the tabernacle. It should never stop. So then when you read then Hebrews 11, then you understand what he meant. While Shaul then was then making sure the Gentiles, they had to be shepherded by the set apart, then the set apart, some of them decided to draw back because they did not like the idea of having Gentiles mixed with them. And then Shaul stated, those who are doing this are then leading themselves to perdition. Precisely what Israel is doing these days. Rather than performing the second service, they drew back, and they are lost. But then the end is coming, and then the Messiah is going to re-establish his holy tabernacles, because discipline is coming upon the tabernacles of Elohim. That's a promised and prophesied from of old. So then Shaliach Shaul was giving many other teachings and explanations. You try to understand the Megillah of the Hebrews. It's a simple explanation of what went on in the previous covenant. Okay? Though you find new information concerning the service of the second, yet the main bulk and the foundation and the columns of foundation of this second is found in the previous. So every time then Shaul speaks in the renewed covenant, dual layer every time. So then you understand how to read the Holy Manuscript. Because any other manual that you read always in flat surface. And that's the bad deal regarding pagan literature. It's always flat. Every time is flat. Sometimes you have some links of similitude, but never in layers. Never truly having the understanding in layers. And these layers, they are not related only with the similitude when regarding the scriptures. They have the similitude, they have the layers related with distinct times. In many events, distinct events, sometimes separated by a long time, yet related in content. That's what makes the holy understandings in the Holy Scriptures very unique. But it takes time to develop then the layering understanding of the mind. But as you can read from the Aramaic, then you begin to develop this understanding, and then you begin then to be more aware of these areas, and then you can be a light to other people. Please stay tuned, much more coming.